Welcome everyone to today's webinar, AI and Google Ads Beyond Text Generation. My name is Riley McLaughlin and I'm the content manager here at Main Street ROI, and I will be your host for today's presentation. I'm also joined by Fred Vallaeys, who's the CEO of Optmyzr, which is a leading PPC management software platform, and Fred will actually be presenting today's webinar. So welcome, Fred.
Thanks, Riley. Good to be here.
Yeah, so today's format for the webinar is going to be about 45 minutes of presentation from Fred. And if you have any questions at any time, please put those in the chat. And there's also going to be some Q&A time at the very end as well. As with other webinars, this is being recorded, so you will get a copy of this presentation tomorrow with a copy of the slides. So you can expect those to be sent out. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Fred.
Cool. Thanks, Riley, and thanks everyone for joining this morning in California. I'm in California. It's 9 o'clock in the morning here, and thanks for spending your lunch hour with me if you're on the East Coast. But I guess given how cold it's been around the country, it's nice to be inside and just watching some videos, right? And learning about GPT, because GPT ultimately, I'm kind of thankful I still have a job, because you look at what's happening these days in the world and it looks like GPT is coming in and taking white collar jobs, and actually it's a bit of a risk for all of us. So it's definitely something people want to talk about, and I'm going to frame it in the context of revolutionizing your PPC campaigns and how you can use the power of generative AI to go beyond text and use it in digital marketing. Now, I'm a little bit bummed that the video's off, because I combed my hair this morning. I'm looking all spiffy, but I do have a little video which is using a lot of the generative capabilities so that you can sort of see my face. So let's hop onto that slide if I can move along here. So it's a little video that I made. It's myself leveraging one of the biggest trends that we've seen in the last year, which is GPT on the one hand and the Barbie movie on the other hand. And I asked generative AI to turn myself into a version of Ken. I asked ChatGPT to write me a bit of a joke about PPC in the context of Barbie. And then I used a different generative system to take the image of myself as Ken and the script that I had to do a voiceover in my own voice. It had cloned my voice, and to make that into a video. So really 4 pieces of generative AI so that you can see my face. So let's see if we can play this video and everyone can hear it. Was ready to use generative AI to take their PPC game to the next level. I'm Barbie Fred, and I'm very good at beach, so I always like to say a well-optimized PPC campaign is like sunscreen. It prevents your budget from getting burned. But besides that, I don't know much about PPC, so here to share what he's learned is the real world Fred. Well, thank you, Barbie or Ken version of Fred. So, take their PPC game to the sorry, we don't have to watch that again. Okay, so here's the real me. And hopefully some of you have seen me speak at conferences before, so I apologize if any of the points I'm going to make today you've heard before, but I've been doing PPC for quite a long time. So I was at Google in 2002, was involved in building Google Ads, basically conversion tracking. I was on the team that bought a company called Urchin, which is now Google Analytics. Was involved on the quality score team. I was one of the original 6 people who built the back then it was called the AdWords editor. It's now called the Google Ads editor. So a long career in PPC, and about 10 years ago, I started a company called Optmyzr, which is a PPC management software. And the reason I did that was because some of the things that Google was building weren't really meeting the needs of advertisers. So for example, like looking at historical quality score. So I decided there was an opportunity for me there, and I started a company called Optmyzr. And then for a couple of years now, I've been thinking quite a bit about automation. And it's not just even GPT, but it's just really automation in PPC and what it means for the human role within it. I wrote a couple of blog posts about that on Search Engine Land, and they ended up doing pretty well. So I thought, hey, maybe there's enough fodder in there to actually go and write a book. So I wrote 2 books on that topic. You can find them on Amazon. And if anyone connects with me on LinkedIn, I'm sure I can find a way to get you a copy of that book as well. So look me up on LinkedIn. Okay, so, but today what we're talking about is GPT, and really I wanted to start with the AI landscape. Now, I live in the Silicon Valley. I'm calling today from Mountain View, California. In fact, the Google office is just across the street from where I am, or one of the many Google offices. And I live in Los Altos, so, and I'm kind of a Silicon Valley nerd. And what I thought was really fascinating is that generative AI, it's really that next wave of major innovation. And it happens to come around every 30 years. And so if we look back in the 1960s in Silicon Valley, the microchip was invented. And Moore's law basically helped make the marginal cost of computing approach $0. And why is that important? Because, all of you probably use spreadsheets to some degree in your digital marketing campaigns. And none of us asked the question of whether we can use spreadsheets and if that's not going to use too much computing power and if that's going to cost too much money. No, basically, thanks to the microchip, these difficult computations have become essentially free to do. There's no marginal cost to them. And then 30 years later, in the early 90s, the internet was invented here. And that, again, made the marginal cost of something approach zero. And in that case, it was the marginal cost of distribution. So now we could put music and songs and videos on the internet and basically make it free to distribute these things. And that revolutionized a whole bunch of business models. And now, again, 30 years later, we're at the forefront of generative AI. And so systems like GPT, which is probably the one that most people have heard about, but also Llama, Palm, Midjourney, Runway ML, Claude, all of these systems are starting to make the marginal cost of creation approach zero. And that's really fascinating because if we think about that in terms of what we're going to talk about today, it's about generating keywords, it's about generating ad text. But if you put all of these three waves of innovation together for a second, and you think about like what's the eventual outcome of where we might be headed, well, think that in a couple of years, there could be a version of Netflix that makes movies for you on the fly based on what it knows about your personal preferences. So I like superhero movies. I like happy endings. If there was a unicorn in the movie, that would make me happy too. So generative AI can write a script about that kind of movie, and generative AI is going to get to the point where it can even take that script and turn it into the actual video content. And so it's not that crazy to think that in a couple of years, we're going to have a version of Netflix that has individual movies for all of us. That's going to be within the realm of possibility. And that really changes how business is done. And I think for us as marketers, we also have to think about, we may be in the early stages where some of the stuff we do is pretty simple, but we're going to get to some really sophisticated stuff down the line. And that's what gets me excited. And I promised I would teach a little bit about AI before we get into the specific digital marketing capabilities here, but I wanted to level set and just make sure people understand there's really two types of AI that are talked about, right? And machine learning, which is the AI that I was doing 15 years ago at Google when we were working on quality score, that was a predictive mechanism that was looking at historical click behaviors of different people and trying to correlate, like, is click behavior different when it's a full moon versus not a full moon? Is it different from city to city? Looking at all of these signals to make to find patterns and make predictions about future clicks, right? So if you think about the traditional story, it's about looking at pictures of animals and deciding, is this a cat or is this a dog, right? That's the kind of the old school AI. And AI, by the way, has been around since the 1960s, but it's only been in the last couple of years that, thanks to Moore's law, computing has been fast enough to really do some of these things in a meaningful way. But now generative AI is it's a version of machine learning, but it uses patterns to create new content. And so it's not about asking, like, is this a picture of a cat? But it's about literally saying, like, I would like a picture of a cat with a pink fur who's sitting on the sidewalk in the city of Portland, Oregon. Now, it is interesting that it didn't actually make the fur of the kitty pink, but it put them in little pink fur coats or jackets, which is pretty funny. But these images are completely made up by GPT, right? And so that's kind of like that next wave of content generation, which is great for SEOs, but it can also be really helpful for digital marketers. And then many of you, if you've been in the industry for a little while, you've probably heard of a guy by the name of Larry Kim. And Larry Kim, he used to run WordStream. And he basically said, we all need to strive to be a unicorn in a sea of donkeys. And what his point was, there's so many marketers, there's so many companies looking to market themselves, and we really need to find ways to stand out. And I don't know why, but I was making this connection in my head when I heard Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, talk. So he's the guy behind GPT. And he was basically asked, well, in the old days of horses, like horses were replaced by cars. Like, what happened to horses? And so he said, like, after the car, people found new uses for horses. And then he pauses and he's like, well, but actually nowadays horses are pretty useless, right? And not to knock on anyone who loves riding horses, but they don't really have a major part in today's economy anymore. And so then when I put that whole unicorn thing together with the horses, I was like, well, you know, the thing for us as marketers is we need to figure out ways to use GPT so that we don't get replaced by it, because it is a bit of an existential threat to a lot of types of jobs that we've been doing manually for a long time. It's not just about your basic automations, it's really taking things to a whole new level. And that's what we want to talk about today. But so let's make sure that you use this generative AI in the right way, because if you use it incorrectly and you don't understand its limitations, you can make some major mistakes, and that's going to make you like those horses that end up being IKEA meatballs instead of being that unicorn that shines in a new campaign. But so if you ask generative AI to predict a budget or a cost per click, you will get up a made-up answer. And so GPT is really about predicting the next word. It's using a lot of mathematics to do this, but it's not actually calculating CPCs, or it's not actually calculating budgets. And I'll share some ways that you can use it to do these things, but out of the box, it does not. So GPT is really about saying, well, if I already had the phrase the cat ... what would be a logical next word to put after that? So it looks at language models and it says, well, I could put in a word like meows or barks. And then it looks at weights and probabilities and machine learning patterns, and it says that meows typically appears closer to the word cats than barks does. So it is more likely that the sentence should be the cat meows. But why, or to say, it could also have come back with the cat purrs as opposed to the cat meows. So it's really just about predicting the next word. And there's no really right or wrong answer, right? Meows or purrs are both equally probable. Now, why is it then that GPT in some cases actually can do math for you? Well, it can do math, but again, it's kind of on a predictive basis. So if you say 1 + 1 = ... well, it looks for the response and it's probably going to be correct and say that the answer is 2, but that's only because that number usually appears in close proximity to the individual words 1 + 1 =. It's not actually doing what a calculator would do or what you would do on a piece of paper to actually add those numbers. So it's kind of to say that if enough people on the internet, which is the data that GPT is trained on, but if enough people on the internet started claiming that 1 + 1 = 3, then GPT would also start saying that 1 + 1 = 3, because it's not using math. It's using math to predict the next word, not to do a calculation. So when we look at some PPC examples of the two types of artificial intelligence, on the one hand, you see machine learning. Again, that's about finding patterns. So it's analyzing historical PPC data to predict the future cost per click or a future click-through rate, like we did with Quality Score. But it can't really do much without your data being put in, right? So you have to feed it your historical data for it to be able to make predictions about future events. Generative AI can actually do a lot of stuff without your data because it's been trained on large portions of the internet, many books, and it uses a form of machine learning to create content. So what you can see there on the right-hand side is in the software that we have, Optmyzr, you can go in and you can say, hey, can you give me a description about a quick performance summary? And so we do a lot of engineering to give it the correct numbers, but the actual writing and the prose and the paragraphs that it puts together, that is generative AI kind of putting the words together in an order that makes sense and putting either a positive or a negative spin on it, depending on what you're asking it to do. It can also provide optimization suggestions. And so these are examples of generative AI. Now, when it comes to doing PPC with GPT, there's really the obvious stuff, right? So you can say, give me ideas for new keywords. And so the prompt that you see at the top, I did the prompt in GPT 3.5 as well as GPT 4, but you can say, find some keyword ideas to advertise the landing page at, and then you fill in the blank with your URL. Or you say on the right, write a few headlines of 30 characters or less for those keywords and that landing page. And what's nice, because this is Chat GPT, it actually maintains the context. So when I said that landing page, it still knows we're talking about the URL that we put in on the left. Now, what's really important to know here is that more recent versions of GPT can actually go and access the content at that URL. But you have to make sure it does, because if it doesn't, it's just going to analyze what it knows about that URL and make some assumptions. And so if I say, like, give me keyword ideas for optmyzr.com, well, it says I historically know some things about optmyzr.com, but I'm not actually visiting that web page at this moment in time. But based on what I know, that it's a PPC management tool, here's a bunch of keywords that might meet your needs. Now with the more recent plugins, and so you can use the Bing capabilities, for example, GPT will actually go and look at that page in real time, but there's no guarantee it does, right? So you have to ask it to go and do that, that more up-to-date crawl. So this is some of the obvious stuff, and this is helpful because writing ad text that can get a little tedious, and getting the system to give you suggestions is really helpful. Now it's also curious, like, why do people talk so much about GPT, and why aren't we using Google's generative capabilities like Google Bard to do some of these things? And you would think Google, being the advertising company, would be helpful, right? But so they don't have an API that really can scale for these use cases. So sure, you could go to Bard, or you could go to POM 2. And POM 2 is their newer model that does have an API, but you'd have to go one query at a time, right? And if you're looking to get keyword suggestions for thousands of ad groups, or you want to get new ad texts for a couple of hundred ads, quickly that does not become scalable. And so we really need a system that has an API. And then also the fact that Google, sadly, often comes back with a response like this. When I say, find me some keyword ideas, it says, sorry, I'm a text-based AI and I can't help with that. That's pretty lame for Google, being the ads company, but that's the reality of how some of their AI is working these days. So that's why a lot of these examples today are about GPT. Now, the other thing, I made a point here that generative spits out words and it uses math to do this. And for a long time, Google's been talking about semantic search, and how SEO is becoming more semantic. It's about understanding the meaning of words. I mean, I kind of understood the principle of that, but really until I started playing with GPT, that's when it opened my eyes to how that really works. And it's about vectors. So vectors are basically mathematical representations of text, and they can have many dimensions to mathematically represent a phrase. So you can see some examples on there. So we have a keyword clustering tool. You can see the input keywords on the left, stuff like German engineering, sedans, horror movies, scary films. Now, German engineering, like, what would that logically be grouped with? Well, it knows that that kind of mathematically is close to cars and luxury vehicles and BMW. So you can see when the clusters come out, even though there's no words in common in that second cluster, the one you see on the bottom right, it does correctly group things together. And that's really the power of semantics. It's about understanding the deeper meaning of words rather than just the words themselves. It was fascinating because I was reading at CES, Walmart is doing some really cool stuff. So they have drone deliveries now that cover 70% of the Dallas area. But one of the other things they mentioned that they do is they're working on a system that you can go to Walmart's website, and rather than looking for sour cream and guacamole, you can type in a search and you can say Super Bowl viewing party, and it'll come back and it will suggest the types of things you might need to host a Super Bowl party. And again, that's about the vectors and semantic search. It's about understanding that for some reason, Doritos have something to do with the Super Bowl, right? There's no words in common, but that's really the power of the semantic search. And what's cool is this is really complicated stuff, but thanks to GPT, we can use this to our advantage in a super easy way. So I can have a prompt like you see here on the left, and you can say, categorize the following keywords and put them in 2 columns. The first column is the keyword, the second column is the categorization. I don't have to explain what categorization means. So now I can literally go to a keyword suggestion tool, pick whichever one you like, grab a list of 1,000 keywords from that, and then you stick it into this prompt, and it'll come back with some categorization that's probably going to make some level of sense, right? If you ask it 5 times in a row, exactly what it categorizes based on could be different, but the categorizations will make sense thanks to this mathematical vectoring and that semantic search that's happening. So where I like to use this is for grouping new ad groups, right? If I have a lot of keyword suggestions, I don't want to just stick 1,000 keywords, broad match keywords into a single ad group. I want to kind of chunk it up, right? I want to have different ad texts that match to each of these concepts. And this is a very helpful tool that very quickly uses very sophisticated math to do that work for me. Now, the other thing, as you start running your campaigns, and you're probably more and more dependent these days on broad match from Google, right? Google's really pushing for broad match, and broad match means that your ads can show for a variety of things. Some of these things may not be that relevant. Now, if you have to look through thousands upon thousands of search terms to understand what's more and less relevant, that can be really tedious. But you can take your whole search terms report, you can stick it into generative, and you can use a prompt like put these keywords in a table and sort them by relevance for a company that makes fill in the blank, in my case, PPC management software. And again, it comes back with some level of scoring. Here I decided to use a 1 to 10 scale. But if I look down the list, the lower the score that it gave, the less relevant these tools are. So like one of them right there at the end is auto posting tools. We're not really a posting tool. We are building social capabilities, but we don't have them quite yet. So that's less relevant. So that's really good to know. That might be a good idea for me for a negative keyword. That's where GPT and generative can be really helpful to streamline your process. And then you can use it for more sophisticated things too, going beyond just text, right? But think of it as your intern to help you with audience development. Pay-per-click and digital marketing is becoming so much more dependent these days on audience capabilities. It's not just the keywords. But so here I had a conversation with it and I said, well, what sort of characteristics or attributes of a hotel would a budget-conscious traveler care about? And I gave it some examples. And I came back and it gave me a couple paragraphs of text. And I said, well, actually, can you just put that in a table and label what the characteristic or the attribute is, and then give me in the second column a bunch of keywords that someone might type in when they are that type of hotel buyer. And so it comes back, and now what I can do is I can go into Google and I can build custom audiences and a custom segment, and I can literally stick in these related search keywords that generative gave me, and I can quickly build an audience around that. And in this case, I call it the price sensitive segment. And so I stick in those keywords. And then for that second grouping that you see on the left side, location, I might call it location sensitive audience and stick in those keywords. So again, doing some of the work that we had to manually go through, generative is really good. And it's going to come back with some ideas of things you could have figured out on your own. But it also sometimes opens your eyes to segments that you hadn't thought about, right? We each as individuals have our own likes and dislikes, and so sometimes it's hard for you to put yourselves in the shoes of a different type of buyer, especially if you're an agency. I mean, you work with so many types of businesses. GPT, having ingested like all the world's information, probably knows a lot more than you do and can really help you build audiences in this case. And you can even use it for CRO, conversion rate optimization, and landing page optimization. So, you know, I said, here, can you take a look at this particular landing page and give me some suggestions for how to make that better? The AI I'm using in this case is actually called Claude. It's an effort that's funded by a lot of the big companies. Google is one of the funders of it. I believe Amazon was also funding it. There was a recent update on that. But Claude is, and it's spun off from a bunch of the people who were building GPT over at OpenAI. So it's another very good system if you haven't tried it. It's called Claude.ai. And so you can do the same thing with GPT, and you can say, can you open the page at that link and provide some ideas for how to make that better? And again, thanks to these plugins now, it can actually go to that live page and it can give you specific tips about, in this case, call to action, like ensure the call to action is more compelling, clearly states what action you want visitors to take. So some ideas for helping you build better landing pages. Now, like I said, if you ask it for budgets and cost per click and doing math, it's going to be wrong. But there is a new way that you can actually use GPT to do an analysis with the code interpreter. So the way that you get to this, you know, and things go in and out of beta, so it may be out of beta at this point, but basically go to chat.openai.com, go to your advanced data analysis beta, and then enable that as you use GPT-4, put it in the advanced data analysis mode. Now, what does the advanced data analysis, or earlier called the code interpreter, what does that do? Well, it writes Python code. And Python is really helpful for plotting stuff, for doing math, for doing media mix analysis, media mix modeling, all of these things it can do. Now, you probably are not a Python coder. You listening to the webinar today, you're probably not a statistician. I'm not a statistician, so I get what some of these concepts are trying to do, but I can't actually go and write the code because I don't know the statistics behind it. But what's nice is you can use GPT to basically have a conversation with this thing, and you can upload data to it, and then you can say things like, hey, can you give me a table of the top 10 most expensive search terms and include columns for this, that, and that? And then it starts spitting that out, and then you can say, well, can you put that into a chart for me, and can you plot it historically over time? And you basically have an interaction. So it might even come back and say, well, listen, Fred, you're asking me to make you some predictions, but did you know that this particular campaign only has very few data points, so it may not be statistically significant? And that's amazing, because that's exactly what a developer on my team would do, right? We'd have a conversation about, like, how do you get a good output from this? GPT is doing that, and then it is writing the actual code that does that. Now, where it does fall apart a little bit in my case was why I said, okay, now I've got this beautiful table of my most expensive search terms. I would also like you to add a column that puts in the relevance of that keyword. And because I was looking at these previous examples that I showed you where categorization and relevance scoring was done so well, I was hoping it would do an amazing job here. But then when I opened up the Python code that it wrote, I saw that it's basically just looking for specific strings being present in the text. So if it says Optmyzr in the text, then it says the score is automatically very high, regardless of any of the other words in the text. So it is a much less sophisticated way of doing the relevance analysis. And again, it's just, I want to make sure you understand where the limitations of these systems lie so that you don't expect it to do things it's not actually good at doing. But yeah, you could use advanced analytics to do your basic Python coding, and then you could take the output of that and then feed that separately into the GPT that I showed you before to actually get that relevance. Now, I for a long time have been talking about scripts. I love writing Google ad scripts. I put a lot of them on search engine land, so look up my name on search engine land and go and download some of those free scripts. But when GPT-4 came out, I was like, hey, well, what would happen if I sent an email to GPT, or I took an email that I'd sent to one of my developers with a request for a script, and I gave that to GPT. And lo and behold, it actually wrote the script and it worked. And that was kind of amazing. I was like, oh my God, and my developers, are we out of a job at this point? But the good news is that it's not doing a perfect job quite yet. You still have to know a few things, right? So GPT can write code, but it may get some of the details wrong. And so what I wanted to do was write a piece of script to generate the CSV data from my Google Ads account, because I needed that CSV data to give to the advanced analytics GPT capability to do some analysis on it, right? So I could go to my Google Ads account and I could manually go and make a report and download it. But I was like, I just want to write a script that automatically spits out the CSV, puts it in the right place, and then it's always ready to go when I need it. So I asked, you can see my prompt on the left side, but I basically asked it to put that CSV code. So when I looked at the code, it was trying to pull 2 date ranges within a single query to Google Ads. Now, if you don't write code yourself, you may not know that this is wrong, but you would quickly find out it is wrong, because if you copy and pasted that code into Google Ads, it would fail at that line, right? So even if you don't know what's wrong with this, you would still know there was a problem at this line of the code. And then you can go back to GPT and you can say, well, hey, can you try it again? Without any changes to the prompt, but just like, give me another version of this code. And it comes back and it makes the exact same mistake. It puts 2 date ranges in a single string. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you can sometimes fix issues with GPT by being more specific, like try not to confuse it. So initially I was prompting it to give me metrics for the previous month and the month before that. And it kept confusing that. It kept trying to do something that doesn't work in Google Ads. So then when I went back and I actually got a little bit more verbose in my specification and my prompt to it, and I said, get the report for 2 date ranges, the last month and the month before that, and then build a map where the key is the campaign name and it includes the stats from the 2 date ranges. it somehow like got the hang of it. And I was like, oh, he's asking for 2 different reports, and then he wants them to be combined together into a single thing. And then it actually does it correctly. It splits the 2 calls for the data to Google Ads into 2 different sections. So if you're going to start writing scripts, just think about being more explicit, being maybe a little bit more of a micromanager, because that's going to help you get the right thing coming out of it. And so when we're talking about being verbose in your prompting to GPT, it's really about prompt engineering. And so here you see fairly lengthy prompt, but there's a couple of things happening here. And sorry, there's a lot happening on this slide, but I've color coded it. So basically the thing in the big box on the left, that is the full prompt that I'm going to give to GPT. I give it context, I give it info, and I give it the prompt and the actual request. The info are my metrics, right? That's where I want to tell it the stuff that I know. The context is about things like, is a low CPA good or bad? You would think that GPT knows if that a high CPA is generally worse than a low CPA, but sometimes it gets these things backwards. So the more explicit you can be and tell it like, this is what I believe, this is what you should also believe, the better of a job it will do when it comes back with recommendations and with text output. And then when it comes to the info and the blue stuff, right, we were actually doing some calculations because we want to give it really explicit data, because if you don't give it explicit data, then it is bound to sometimes start making stuff up. And that's the last thing we want when we're generating a report in GPT that we give to a manager or a stakeholder, right? And so when it comes to doing the math, so instead of asking, you know, here you have a campaign called Apples and it had impressions, clicks, cost, and conversions. I'm actually doing some of the math for it. I'm saying, well, based on that data, the CTR was 10%, the CPA was $7, the average CPC was $2.10. And again, you might look at me and say, hey, Fred, like that's really basic stuff. Why are you wasting your time doing this for GPT? Well, it's because if you don't, it's going to get it wrong. There was a super interesting study out of Stanford, and it looked at GPT-4 over the span of 3 months. Asking it if a certain number was a prime number. It got that answer correct about 70% of the time in, I believe it was March. And then a couple of months later, that exact same question for that exact same number, whether it's a prime number or not, it went from being 70% correct to only 40% correct. And this is called drift. So these GPT systems, they have drift because it's mathematical, like the weights and the way that they analyze things, it keeps changing. So the fact that it gives you a correct answer today does not mean it's going to give you a correct answer tomorrow. And so also if you use advanced analysis and you have some of these Python scripts written for you, make sure that you copy and paste it after you validated it, rather than going back and getting a new script written the next time you need that analysis, right? So because that next time the script could have a mistake in it that it didn't have today. So that's why we're doing a lot of the math for it. So I know this is all a lot of stuff with the scripts, but if you just want to try it out yourself, there's a link right there. I put all of this together in a little script you can download. The instructions are on Search Engine Land, and you can play with it. It's a free script to put in your Google Ads account, and it uses GPT. Now, a couple of other things to wrap up here. But what about if you're doing image campaigns? And this is applicable to Google Ads, but it's also if you're running ads on Meta or on Instagram. You might want to have some image assets, or you might just be writing a blog post, right? And so I write blog posts for my website, optmyzr.com, and this is what optmyzr.com looks like. So you can see we have sort of a visual style that we like to use for images. Now, I went to Alpaca ML, which is a system that can generate images. And I was like, well, give me a few images. And, you know, yuck. Let's just leave it at that, yuck, right? So it's not a good fit for the Optmyzr brand. Now, the nice thing is that Alpaca ML, you can actually train it with as few as 15 to 100 images from your own site. So you feed it those images, and then it comes back and it proposes a couple of different models to you. So I've given it images, and then it says, well, here's a couple of options. Which one do you like best for each of those prompts that you see at the top? And so I start going through that, and I do a couple of rounds of this, and so it hones in on, okay, Fred seems to like a specific model better than all of the others. So that becomes your model now. So now I can plug this into Photoshop, and now when I give it a prompt, the images that come back are much more in line with the Optmyzr style. The color scheme is being followed, the types of people that you see all that is being followed. It's by no means perfect, but you know what? For me, I'm not an illustrator. I don't know how to draw. If I can even do something like this and give it as an example to one of the illustrators on my team, we're that much closer to me having specced out like what it is I want, right? It just makes my whole team more efficient, and it enables me to do things I couldn't imagine doing before. So much better images coming out of that. And then here's a little party trick. If you want to use Alpaca ML, it can go from a doodle to an actual image. So I was at this conference, which was in Newport Beach, and but it's a conference that also had been in Brighton SEO. Brighton in the UK, they have a Ferris wheel. Newport Beach has a pier. So I was like doodling an image of a pier and a Ferris wheel. And I was like, turn this into an image and make sure there's some people like at a conference talking about SEO and PPC. And boom, there you go. I got that image. Again, I'm not an illustrator. This is something that I could use on a slide deck that would have taken me significant amount of time to do in the past working with people. Now it can just be done by generative. So it just opens doors for me. Now, as we look at all of this, hopefully you're all fans, you're all thinking of ways that you're going to be able to use this, but some reasons that people have resisted AI that we've heard so far. There was an MIT study, but basically radiologists, they underrated the AI advice because they're trying to protect their own jobs. But what the analysts saw was that if the AI analysis has a 90% plus confidence level, then you can just use it. If the confidence of the AI model was less than 90%, then it makes sense to have humans validate what the AI is saying and do a couple of rounds of that until everybody's in agreement, right? But in some cases, AI is just going to be highly confident, and in those cases, you can often let it make decisions on its own. And this, of course, applies to PPC as well. These are not life and death decisions like radiologists who are looking for a cancer might do. So, there's money to lose, but no lives to lose. So hopefully that's a little bit less stressful. But again, look at those high confidence levels, let the AI run its thing there. And then writers, writers were basically saying, well, generative AI writing isn't as good as human writing. But that was a very selfish perspective from a writer saying like, listen, I'm a fantastic writer. Gen AI is not as good. But like at the end of the day, ask the question, does the reader care? Do you write that much better that the reader actually meaningfully prefers what you wrote versus what the machine could have written? Not great news for writers necessarily, but listen, if the reader doesn't care and you as an organization can produce that much more high quality, good content, sure, it's not going to win Emmys, it's not going to win an Oscar for best screenplay, right? But it's going to be good enough that your movie is going to make a ton of money. And I'm saying movie here, but put it in terms of PPC. If that ad that was written by a machine convinces the user to click on the ad, and then the landing page with the copy written by generative convinces the person to leave their information in the form, well, job done, right? Like, why spend a lot of money on humans writing if the machine is good enough at that? And so ultimately, think about it this way. You're not competing against AI, but you're competing against other marketers who came to this webinar and who figured out better ways to use AI to their advantage. That's who's going to beat you. That's where you're going to lose. So hopefully you've taken away a couple of ideas from this. Would love it if you connected with me on LinkedIn, take a look at my book, definitely take a look at the Optmyzr software. It's really good PPC software to streamline your work, and it's got tons of AI built into it as well. So with that, thank you, and let's take a look at some of the questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Fred. All right, so let's see. So we have a question from Massimo, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you have a GPT prompt list for different PPC needs, such as market research, data analysis, budget forecast, performance forecast, etc.?
So I don't maintain a prompt list per se, but I have blogged on Search Engine Land, and I believe one of those blogs was like a couple of ways that you can use GPT to do different things, and those will have prompts in it. I think ultimately, like again, prompt engineering is sort of the differentiator, and as I've shown, I think one thing that is really important is to do in a field like digital marketing where the numbers do matter, to do a lot of the math for the system, right? And then the prompt itself, like what voice to take or whether to be positive or negative, that's more of the standard stuff. But it's a good idea, Massimo. Maybe that's something I should put together and share with the community. thank you for that question.
Great. And we have a question from Julia. Looks like this is kind of a two-part question. Does this mean that Optmyzr is going to incorporate all or most of the features you just presented? If yes, what is the roadmap that you've envisioned?
Yeah, I've shown you a mix, Julia, of what's already in Optmyzr and what isn't. So the sidekick capability where you can have a conversation with a generative system, that's already in there. We've actually been doing ad text suggestions using GPT before ChatGPT was even a thing. And so I think for a lot of companies, whether it be Optmyzr or another software tool that you use, they're also, it's going to be like that saying where, well, sorry, I forgot what the saying was, or making a bad example. But like generative AI is just going to become such a default part of any software because it just has to be in there, right? So, but it may not be like in your face as like, here's the generative AI way to generate keyword suggestions. It's more that we use it on the back end as we give keyword suggestions to put it through another layer of getting more suggestions or validating those suggestions so that what we leave you with as a marketer has taken benefit and has leveraged that new technology, but without you having to really understand how all those pieces work together. If you want to be more hands-on, then certainly the scripts that I'm writing are going to give you a little more flexibility to take a look at that code, but also start modifying it in any way that you see fit. Also on the roadmap, the generative capabilities and reporting, right? So right now our reports are very visual, but you can start adding descriptions. So you can say, okay, well, here's a paragraph that explains what you're seeing in that chart to make those reports, just to give you basically another option.
Great. And Kim, yes, you will get a copy of the slides, so those will be emailed tomorrow. All right. And then Jel has a question. How can I ensure that sharing customer data with this AI technology is secure and that the privacy of my customers is protected?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, obviously, if you're going to go into GPT or Claude or any of those systems and you feed it customer data, then that customer data will flow to that company and be used. The question then to ask is the version that you're using, does it allow your inputs to become part of future training models? And that depends. And I don't know the answer for everything. And I think if you pay for GPT, then you have the option to exclude your prompts from future learning, so it stays more private. But the way that we approach it in Optmyzr, for example, is we would never teach, we would never build our own versions of models using customer data, right? So we build generic models with things like, again, a high CPA is worse than a low CPA. We teach it stuff like that. We've taught it everything that's in my book so that we kind of like take the strategies and it can talk about those strategies. But at the time that you decide as a customer of Optmyzr to send your data, that's when you make the decision, right? I'm either going to use generative, and using generative means that I have to give it my campaign data to get an insight about those campaigns. But until you do, no data is shared. But again, that depends from company to company. That's how we think about it.
Great. And I'm not seeing any more questions, but we do have a little more time. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat.
Yeah, and I'm sure there might be questions that people prefer asking sort of one-on-one. So if you connect with me on LinkedIn, very happy to have a conversation there. But you know, in vein of using GPT to become more efficient and saving time, maybe we'll give everyone 15 minutes in their days back and let them play with some of this stuff.
Yeah. And
So
then,
Riley, I'll kick it back over to you and let you say the final words.
yes, of course. One sec. So, okay. Just looking at the chat. Yes, you're welcome, Julia. All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. And thank you, Fred. I learned a lot, and I'm excited to implement some of this stuff. So yeah, again, the recording and the slides will be sent out tomorrow, so you can expect those in your inbox. And if you would like to connect with Fred, it sounds like LinkedIn is the best way to do that. And with that, we can go ahead and close. So thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.